Welcome to the I'm Telling God About This podcast. I am curious, if you are listening right now, what generation are you in? Today's topic, we're going to be talking about the generational divides, generational differences, possibly a little bit of ageism, possibly some of the contention going on. So we have Gen Alpha, Gen Z, Millennial, Boomer. That is, by and large, the breadth
Gen
of this
X,
conversation.
but
and
everybody
Gen
forgets
X.
about
and then
Gen
everybody
X
forgets
anyway,
about
so.
Gen
The
X. So if
irony
you're
about
listening
forgetting-
right now, leave a comment below about which generation you are, and if you are the Gen X, the forgotten generation, you can go ahead and leave a comment as well.
Think about how salty you have to be, though, to be Gen X and have both Gen Z and Gen Alpha be a moniker continuation of really the brand that the boomers put on you as the delinquent drug addict generation, and they don't even remember that you exist.
I mean,
What is the age? Okay, so I'm 86.
83.
So I missed
83
being
to
Gen X
97. Or
by
Gen
3
X
years.
is
That's pretty wide for
65
millennial.
Here, I just pulled it up. Gen X is 65 to 80. Boomer is 46 to 64. And then I guess the silent generation, yeah, that's further back. Yeah,
No, what's-
sorry.
what's-
And
Millennials
then
is
Z
80,
is 96.
What's
to 12.
millennial?
And millennial is 81 to 96.
Sorry, say that last part again. I think I interrupted. What
Oh
was
yeah,
I've
so
seen-
Alpha is 2013 to 25. Z is 96 to 2012. Millennial is 81 to 96. Gen X, the one I forgot about, is 65 to 80. And then Boomer are the really older people that we still know as 46 to 64.
which we have some Gen X in our audience.
We do.
You know, a good portion.
Well, and to be fair, like, who here was born? All of us were born in the 80s,
So we're all
right?
millennials.
Tim, all of
I
us.
was born
Okay,
in the
check.
How young do you...
Just making sure. I
That's
knew you're the youngest.
amazing.
I just couldn't remember
Yeah,
by
it's
how
true.
much.
Little
I'm not trying to
whippersnapper
insult
over
you.
there.
All right, so we're all 80s. So my point is that we are on the we are elder millennials, and so we have many of the same. We bridge that gap in a weird way. We sit on
We
that
remember
like
before
shoulder.
the internet. I know how to
That's
address
right.
an envelope. That's the...
Yes, absolutely. And we also have some of the same attributes of like all of the public policies and stuff that were born, like DARE and the whole like, do you know it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your kids are? Like that's our parents, you know, like that was still the age that we grew up in. So there's still the fundamental difference, I think, between us and like pure Gen X is that because we saw the internet really start to take on life when it mattered around middle school, we have a sense of hope and like vision that Gen X
got shellacked
stereotypically doesn't have.
repeatedly, okay? I mean, think about it. They would have just been starting to come into their careers and build wealth, and then you get the dot-com crash. I mean, just backhanded, like hard, okay? Then, all right, they recover from that. They get their feet under them. They can finally buy a house. Boom, housing crash. Just, right? That's true.
I didn't think of it like that. You're right. You're absolutely right.
That's
so
us
finally
too.
you claw your way out of that mire, and then you're supposed to be in the middle of your prime earning years, and the government is like, you got to shut down your business for at least 6 months,
Oh, my
just right
If
now.
not longer.
They have been abused brutally. If anybody has an actual a genuine generational gripe against everybody, against the world, it's Gen X. And there is actually probably a pretty good reason why that happened, because politically, a lot of the choices you make are going to be done to benefit and protect the most politically influential generation, and that's been the boomers for a long time. Like, there are more obviously younger people than just boomers, but in terms of any one generation, they're the most influential, they're the richest. And so when you've got any kind, like, so when you look at like the response to COVID, right, all of the extreme caution that went into that's very much a elderly take to sit there and suppress viruses at the expense of the active economy and people who would be doing things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and that's, we've talked about this book a bunch on here, but The Fourth Turning talks about, it's really the guys who
There's
wrote
your
it
breakdown.
did their study on generational dynamics. Oh, did I cut you off, Tim? I'm
No,
sorry.
I was just gonna say we need like a fourth turning jar just on your desk. Every time you say it, you've got to put a dollar.
Yeah,
in.
we do. Well, it comes up a lot because it's poignant. So like we have this issue of like the whole concept of why the generational debate matters is because it directly impacts the world. When people talk about why history feels cyclical, why every 80 years we have a major conflict, it's because every generation responds to the same stimulus differently. Look at World War I. It took us forever to get into the war. We get hit even after the Lusitania and a bunch of other reasons that we could have gone to war. September 7th happens, and the very next day, war is declared.
September 7th.
And we have a full national mobilization.
Is that?
This
Did
September
I say
11th.
September? Sorry, excuse me.
Wait,
December.
December 7th? Okay,
December
what?
7th.
You said
No,
September
I'm talking-
11th.
He's
December
talking about
7th.
World War II in contrast
Okay.
to World
No,
War
no, no.
I.
I was
Yeah,
like,
I'm
that's
World War II and World
Sorry
War
about
One.
that. Yeah, go
Sorry.
ahead. December 7th.
Forgive me.
What the heck happened on
But yes,
September 7th?
so generational temperament matters, and one of the things that book really did for me, and I think is at the heart of what we're talking about today, is it made me think of history in seasons, and that whole adage, strong men make good times make weak men make hard times.
And then there's a conflict.
And so if you know where you're at in that bingo. And so like if you know where you're at in that thing, so like if say you've got a baby boomer boss, if we look at how the generations are kind of broke out, it kind of lets you know what they're going to be okay with, what they're going to be afraid of, because you talked about risk aversion and those types of things. What do you got for us, Josh?
So boomers say weak men create hard times, and millennials and zoomers are like, you're the weak man who created hard times.
That's very, very.
That is so true.
Which I don't know about you guys, but for me, that's actually it's helpful personal motivation where I think it's not really disputed that that's the case. But I don't know. For me, I use that because I'm a millennial, but I'm not going to be weak, and I'm going to raise my children in such a way that is different, and I'm not going to contribute to the trend or to the stigma, and I'm going to try and go up the current. And I don't know. So I agree with that phrase wholeheartedly. But it's also motivation for me to not be that way.
Yeah, well, for the record, millennials are not the weak men, which is actually funny because, when we were growing up, everyone was making fun of them, which is the trend in general. Each older generation makes fun of the new upcoming one. But in all actuality, we millennials are the ones who inherit the hard times and therefore are the hard men. Like we parallel on the cycle. We parallel the GIs, the greatest generation, the ones that won World War II. So if you think about it in Star Wars, the way that they talked about it in the book is you have basically 4 archetypes of the generations. You have the prophet generation, the nomad generation, the hero generation, and the artist generation. So the prophet generation is the baby boomers. All right. If you look at that historically, you have the reformers were prophets, the Puritans for like the Great Awakenings, the Transcendental, the missionary movement, and baby boomers. Right. The nomads are
which is why we forget
Gen
about them
X.
all the time.
All right. Exactly, because they're displaced. They're between conflicts. Then you have the hero generation, which is us and the millennials. And then you have the artist generation, which is the Gen Z. And really that like Gen Z and like Alpha, kind of fall into that as well. And so when you look at it in that regard, it helps. I think of it, the character archetypes are really like typified in Star Wars, where you have Obi-Wan Kenobi as the prophet. You have Han Solo as the nomad, Gen X. You have Luke Skywalker as the naive, passionate, and willing to act like idealistic and willing to take action hero. And then I'm not exactly sure who the artist is in that category. Maybe it's Jar Jar Binks. I don't know. But the 3 big ones,
I'd still rather Jar Jar Binks than anything from Kathleen Kennedy.
Ankle socks are peak efficiency.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the divide here, because I think it happens on multiple levels, and we tend to see this online, right? So we tend to see a divide between boomers and Gen Z or millennials, but then also there's a divide between millennials and Gen Z. It seems like in a lot of the videos online. But if I could just real quick, I did found a study from Oxford. They were talking about like understanding and managing intergenerational conflict. Mostly within the workplace, and I thought there were some really interesting things to take out here. Now, granted, this is just one study of many that I think that there's other conclusions of, but I'd like to get your guys' feedback about some of the things that I've found. So, with these tensions in the workplace between boomers or older, and I would say that it's not necessarily didn't really say that they were just boomers. It was just tend to be older generation, younger generation within the workforce. But there's some things when it comes about like the tensions, right? There's value-based tensions, behavioral-based tensions, and identity-based tensions. And so for the older generation, they tend to value tradition, compliance with organization policies, and the status quo. So like if something comes,
I'm sorry, which generation?
This is the older generation, right, within the workplace. Okay. And I imagine this is probably boomers as well as Gen X, whoever's still working. But the older generation would fall into this category where, like, if something came down the line from executives, people would fall in line. The older generation, but they might not like it, and they might speak up about it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about the organization, right? It's about the company. We want the company to stay around.
Well, and the cost benefit for making a stink at that age is a lot different, right? You're more established. You probably are making more money. You have a lot more social capital, influence in the stuff, right? And so the amount of counter incentive that it takes for you to decide something's worth making a stink about is probably a lot higher. Whereas if you're, you know, a fresh green whatever, and you stub your toe on something, you're like, this is the worst thing that has ever happened to anyone, and I will take a stand.
Right. Yeah, and so they're that tends to be like a older generation, whereas they want to keep things the same, or they're more in line with whatever executives say, whereas the younger generation, they tend to embrace like more innovative things. They're wanting to do the exciting high risk stuff. And
I think there's
within companies
a more generous way to characterize that on the part of the older generation, just because that makes it sound like you're talking about I'm just set in my ways, I don't like change, and I'm sure there's some of that, right? But particularly working in, you know, a tech environment, right? One of the things you see is a lot of younger people get really excited about a new technology or a new platform or new ways of doing things. I mean, you might remember Agile, right? For instance, you know, and it's the older people who have been through certain waves of that and think, you know, I know that the new thing is probably not as good as it's claimed to be, and that we also have to concern ourselves with what we're going to maintain in the future. And I also know why things are the way they are, because a new person isn't going to look at the way things are and see those as solutions to problems that have been solved in the past, right? So I just on that score, I think that's the nice way to view the I don't like change attitude.
And this is more of like the values. These are what is these particular generations value the most, is according to this study, right? In regards to the work, like a younger generation values high pace, lots of change, but they're not really understanding the risk whereas the value of older generation, and I think you kind of really summed that up. Then there's like behavioral based tensions, which the older generation believes in this earning reward through hard work type and dedication over time, commitment. They view itself more as committed to work, with focusing on long-term stability and loyalty to a single employer. That tends to be an older generation thing. Whereas the younger generation...
One of the things you're seeing there is a certain amount of survivorship bias, right? And so you probably remember when you were early on in your career and you knew those people who were like, oh, office job is for chumps, blah, 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 this is stifling, I can't work in these conditions. Well, those people don't work in those environments anymore. And you, who were able to thrive sufficiently, or you did not find it to be like the soul-sucking thing. And this is one of the reasons you always see Hollywood and visual media portraying office jobs as this soul-sucking thing, because those movies are all made by people who would feel that way in an office corporate environment, where obviously plenty of people find that, find plenty of fulfillment, rewardingness, etc.
Yeah. And on top of that too, I don't want to there there is a big difference between it's not just old versus young, because generations, like their temperament and how they act at when they're in different stages of life are different. So like generally speaking, I would agree with you, Josh. Like, yes, generally speaking, like some of the ones you listed are attributes of just getting older. Like, yes, the older you get, you tend to be a little bit more pragmatic. The older you, yeah, because
And
there's
I think
some
that's an important
general
distinction that you're
cases in
making.
which those things are, but they are very much varied based on kind of which one of those four quadrants, at least from the study that, the guys in the Fourth Turning did. And one of the
Jar.
things that they talk about, like, that I thought was interesting is how the age breakdown. So like if you look at, say, like Gen X, or not Gen X, if we look at the nomad generations, like the baby boomers, right? Or excuse me, not the nomads. The nomads are Gen X. Sorry. So 0 to
nomads were
20,
the
Gen X
X.
felt like are abandoned, right? So they feel abandoned. That's why we get nihilism. That's why you look at the music that came out of that era, right? Then, in their 20s and 40s, they feel alienated because they have no great war, no struggle, no identifying cohesion, no great fight. And so how do they look in their 40s and 60s, which is where they're at right now? That Gen X boss that you have is very pragmatic. He'll break the rules if it makes sense. He'll push back against the boss if it'll get a result that actually saves him time and energy. They have no allegiances to corporation or to whatever. They're just simply looking for the
they're
best
still
way
the
to make
most
their
punk
life
rock
survivable.
generation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But if you look
Yeah.
now here's one though that will really resonate. Let's look at baby boomers. So 0 to 20, indulged. These are the children of people who survived real warfare and who grew up with parents who went through the Great Depression. This generation does not want their kids to suffer. So I don't know about you guys, but I grew up hearing stories about like my parents. Oh, I got a dirt bike for Christmas when I was like 8.
Yeah.
Like I did, like look at the cars they drove around. Like we watch all those old movies of like, kids being 16, 17 driving around in like convertibles and like
They also had
all
30
these,
houses in their
like
entire
indulged.
neighborhood, right? Like it was population was
Right.
super
Also
low.
that,
Everybody
right?
knew everybody.
So-
There was no risk, right?
Yeah. And then so then you look at them from 21 to 41, they were narcissistic. And guess what year that was? That was the 80s. That was all the peak of excess in the 80s when the baby boomers were in their peak earning years and
Well, and
producing,
then the
right?
mania
And
of
then
the
you
90s,
look at
and the
right, exactly. So then now look where they're at now between more in 42 to 62, which has been the last decade really. They're moralistic. They've got all these ideological, it's all of this like, hey, we should all be better. Like that's where like the climate change arguments, all the social justice stuff, that's all the maturation of baby boomer like jargon. And now finally 63 to 83, they're the wise sage trying to shepherd the younger
So
they're
my
generation.
not
question
though.
to you on that,
They're not
So very
shepherding the
interesting.
younger generation.
I know that's their perception.
I have a
like
question
that's how
though,
they
Josh,
that's how
because you
they're
made a good distinction.
yeah.
You made a good distinction about like just changes in old age. Would you say that some of the and granted, to be fair, this study didn't go and say, oh, there's this many boomers, this many Gen X, this many. It just tended to be an older generation with larger years of work experience than younger generation. So maybe that's not as directed at this particular conversation, but would you say like that the characteristics of self-preservation, of looking out, watching your back, playing the politics game, tends to be a characteristic that it doesn't matter which generation you're from, you tend to go in that direction as you get older in general?
No, I don't think so, because I think that's what we're seeing here. If you look at the distinct difference between, so let's look at the hero generation. They were in their 60s. They're hubristic, right? So they tend to drive hard for things. Like, they might overshoot and do different things, but they're engaged still. Whereas, like, the whole idea of like how I guess what we're talking about, if we're talking about this in the context of like behavior, right? Let's look at baby boomers. Like, here's the funny thing. The politics I'm going to speak about politics as it relates to morality, and so I'm not speaking about this in terms of our current government. So there's my disclaimer. But if you look at the politics and the ideas that exist today, they've been around for 30 years. Okay? So what happened in the last 10 years that made things go crazy? And it's simple. The baby boomers started talking about floating and initiating concepts like global warming, like, there were some actions and some activity with, some let's take more progressive, policies, right? But it wasn't until the millennials started and the Gen X started taking higher office that you started to see those things getting executed and done. The point that I'm saying is that baby boomers have become less about doing the older that they've come. They become less pragmatic. They're not worried about things. Like, they know they're taken care of. They're only staying in power. They're only floating on the soil because they're enjoying it. I don't think it has anything to do with their desire, because previous generations didn't do that. The GI generation after World War II, they slipped quietly into anonymity
what you're
and
saying
retired.
is, like, maybe the next phase of our generation as the hero generation, we're going to embrace a tragic conflict of some sort, whether it be political, moral, war, whatever it is.
It could just be
our
cultural.
generation.
Like, that's an
and it could be
option.
cultural.
Yeah.
And that's probably more likely, right? So we face this revolution or this conflict. We're going to come out the other end winning with what other decision, or stance if we win.
If we win.
Then the millennials, instead of trying to preserve our own retirement, our own status quo, it'll be more of like, hey, we want to enable the next generation to grow or to maintain or to flourish.
No, I think we'll make sure we're good, just like the GIs did. The difference is like the silent generation, every generation that was in power made sure that generation was taken care of. The GIs didn't really have to do it for themselves.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Like, they came out of World War II, and the government had made sure that generation would be set. And the silent, basically, like, it was kind of like, for those people who were in the Army, or what you guys remember about post 9/11, the attitude towards the military. And Josh, you remember, you've been in long enough, how it was being when you would go into an airport, even as late as
the cultural
the 2010s. Like, if I walked into a place and I was like, hey, I'm a service member, the attitude was, come right this way. Let me get you straight up. Let me take care of you, right?
When I was in uniform. Yeah.
Like, all the time, right? Now, that's like not the case. And so that's kind of the attitude is what I'm getting at. So I'm saying, like, those guys didn't have to do that because they
had accrued enough social
they were
debt
able to just
social capital.
What you got?
From there.
Exactly.
What you got, Nick?
So I just got a question postulate to you. I don't know if you guys saw that link that I shared with you all last night, but we covered this in an earlier episode, which is the rise of cultural Christianity. And Tim, your comment about, maybe it is a cultural disintegration. Like, it doesn't have to be a war. We're not saying we have to have some chaotic thing take place that resets the generation and we're the heroes that restore peace and hope to the world and then start the cycle again. I'm curious because I think this is a hopeful vision that I actually think makes a lot of sense from what I'm seeing in on the lay of the land. And we're already seeing a backlash to LGBTQ plus ideology. We're already seeing a backlash to gender politics, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're seeing a rise in cultural Christianity. We're seeing a resurgence of, and we covered this in a past episode, but like more people are flocking to the Jordan Petersons, the Konstantin Kissins, these individuals that fall into this category, and we're seeing and so I wonder if the millennials, which means you're age 28 to 43 as of the filming of this episode, like, what if we are shepherding in and stewarding a resurgence of traditional conservative liberalist values that kind of maybe would recycle things and start again. I don't know. I that's a more hopeful vision than it all has to burn and we'll get in a civil war and then we'll be out the other side.
No,
Some
I
things
think you're
do
right,
have to
Nick.
burn.
No, but that's it. That is it. Because they're dug in. That's the point. Like, that's the point that these guys making these books is that the system stays as it is until it basically gets disrupted by, like, it gets so locked in and these ideologies get so dug in that something has to happen to basically cull that and move it away. And so, they say that we're in that period right now. So what you're seeing is the start of what leads to conflict. And we saw this every 80 years. We've seen the same thing where what ends up happening
Well,
is
he didn't say the name of the book.
people see.
I was gonna say, what?
I didn't
you
say
keep
the
saying
book.
that. What does that mean?
People see
It's a fourth turning reference.
every
Like a
time I
swear
mention
jar?
the fourth turning.
So it needs a little.
Look, I'm giving these guys credit because this book, these two books, The Fourth Turning and The Fourth Turning is Here, have done an exceptionally good job, and we have in them. The book was published in '96, and so when we read it today, we can already see that their premise has held up. And so my point is this: what they say is, to your point, Nick, we are in the fourth turning now. And so what you expect to see before a period of turmoil and conflict is people placing a higher premium on their values and their convictions than they do on their social or even physical well-being. And that's where we're at, where people have realized that if we don't stand for things that are important, we will continue down the road we're already on. It's untenable.
We're in it / on the backside of the turmoil. What if COVID? What if these? That's what I'm. My premise is that and again, tell me I'm wrong, but what if that was the turmoil, that has been the turmoil, and we're seeing now coming down the other side of it? And
You think we've already topped we're on the
what I'm
downhill
proposing.
of this conflict?
Here's the problem, though. The drivers of the resolution of conflict, of things like really the pandemic probably being the biggest thing that you could point to and say crisis, that was not resolved by any disruption or serious fundamental change of the existing order of things. In fact, that was that was resolved by doing everything humanly possible to maintain the existing order, particularly for the sake of the older generation, right? I think it was before the show I was saying how if you're a boomer, right, you're older, you think this virus poses a particular threat or whatever, and you're trying to make sure that you can keep your wealth, enjoy your retirement, and all of a sudden this threat shows up. The response of basically shutting down the economy, I mean, in a literal sense, for the sake, at the expense of the younger generation, that's something that the older generation did. That was not a disruption that changed anything. That was just one crisis that really failed, actually, to topple those existing paradigms.
And even if you look at, they cover this in the book where they talk about how there's like a blip before the big one, that there's a moment where, and so they would point to that and say they looked at the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and September 11th as being that major blip where it looks like society is going to be able to rally and rise above, but it's not sustainable and it doesn't show a major change of course. And so the pandemic is really what was the catalyst for what you're talking about, which is when people realized the pandemic kind of showed the emperor has no clothes, and showed people how government can really cause problems.
Lots of lost faith in institutions that people previously relied on.
Right. Yeah. And the church and many other things, not just that. So that's why I would say and they would agree. So they put it at somewhere around 2035 we'll be out of the woods. So whatever happens
So
between now and then.
let me just bring up an
but
interesting point kind of in the study that I saw in regard to the way that the older generation actually deals with like conflicting or conflict as opposed to the younger generation. One of the things that struck me is that the older generation, when it comes to like a conflict, they tend to just remove themselves. They're like, well, if I don't get along with somebody, I'm just not going to talk with them. Like, I'm not going to address it. I'll let them do their thing. And I see this as the mindset that was held as you could do whatever you want behind closed doors. Just don't try to force it on me. I'm just don't mess with me. Don't let it affect my life. And essentially the weak man mentality, right? Like I'm just not going to do anything, and let me just avoid it because it doesn't really affect me. It's not a battle that I'm willing to fight. And so I wonder if we fall into that's where we've kind of fallen into, and it's going to take our generation to basically say, no, we're not going to ignore this. We're going to address it here because we have to. We've gone silent long enough, and I think that's what we're seeing in a society with everything that has shifted. And that we're starting to see these shifts of going back to this, wait a minute, have we been lied to all this time? Or the emperor has no clothes? It comes down to, I think, of the summer of love in 2020 with the whole riots with BLM and everything. I think what ended up happening is everybody was like, yes, there's a problem here, with George Floyd and everything. But then they started seeing these riots, and they started seeing billions of dollars worth of damage. And we were told to, as a society, to just let people rage, let people do this. And there's no such thing as law and order. And the response was like, wait a minute, hold on. I was on board for something that unjust happened. I was not on board for just destroying civilization and society and our identity as a country. And so you start seeing that same thing with the LGBT movement, where you started to see some trend towards it in Hollywood, and it's everywhere in commercials and everything like that. But then there was the shooting in Tennessee. Was it Tennessee? Where there was the trans.
Tennessee. There was one in
it was
Florida.
Tennessee.
Then
There have
that
been
was-
a
that
number.
was
That one was the most
Yeah.
well publicized.
And I think
but
that
there's
was the
actually
one
been
that
a lot of trans shootings.
Right. So once that happened, it was so well publicized. I think at that point you started to see this hard line of saying no, we're not playing this anymore. Like,
that's
no.
my premise.
Well,
And so there was that where it's
Right.
starting. And so maybe we're just starting to actually hit that.
no, because
Hit
here's
that
the
conflict,
issue.
or like that realization.
We
Go
are,
to
yeah,
Amber, that's
Josh.
no close.
I agree. So Nick, I agree with you. This is the start of
That's
people
my
standing
point.
up, but here's what I'm getting at. But this isn't the end of it, because here's what happens. Because millennials, like I've said, we're idealistic and we're action oriented. Okay? So what that means is what really matters for the millennial is who's the sensei. Because if you've got the reformers and you've got good pastors and good, conservative mentors that are building you up in a biblical worldview, and they're setting you on fire for, the Great Commission and building after that, then you're going to see a tremendous amount of growth and a tremendous, wave of new leadership in the church and on the mission field and in the realm of apologetics, which I think you're seeing all of that. And you're going to see Christians in government, stepping up and moving into those spaces. But on the other side, you're going to have people whose, sensei are, their mentors are people from, the radical progressive side of the house in this LGBTQIA. And that's why we're seeing a tremendous amount of young people that are also that are acting this stuff out. That's why you pointed it out, Josh. That's why we have seen increased political violence. We've
the
seen
actual Civil
increased
War
rioting for just about everything.
Was a crisis
Right.
of this variety, right? Like the threat,
Yeah.
the crisis doesn't have to be exogenous, and the threat does not have to be external to you.
No.
One of the things we're having to deal with is all of the stuff that has been allowed to be cultivated and is damaging right beside us. This rot.
Right. Will to fight is the point that I'm getting at, is that will to fight is what matters. And the difference between previous generations and ours is that in this cycle, the heroic generation is the generation that's willing to fight. And so what we get to is the generation cycles wind up, they lead to us. We take ideological sides, and then we fight. And so that'll either be an
So,
external existential
Are
threat,
we at the stage
or
where we're
it'll
taking
be
ideological sides at
an
this point?
initial one.
Oh, hands down, yeah. There's no questions asked.
for
and
sure.
with overtly
Hard.
and intentionally choosing not to say anything about politics, I would say, per my original premise and the election of a certain individual last term, that there's a lot of this interesting dialogue happening around maybe the House and the Senate is going to go to one side, and maybe there is going to be an interesting turn of events taking place. I'm not in any way saying the Democrats or the other sides are not sound or not good people or are not going anywhere. I'm just saying, if I step back and I look at the landscape and I look at COVID and I look at the things I mentioned, the LGBTQ plus, the pushback against it, you, Josh, did a really good job of mentioning the rise of maybe some church leaders, the rise of maybe some vocal leaders, the rise of podcasts, the rise of the things Joe Rogan
Alternative
is saying,
media.
the rise of, these are all leaders. They, whether, we might have to go 20 years out and look back to call it that, but I'm saying right now, I think you can call it that and see it if you look at it with those lenses. And I'm saying, you said 2035 was the book's proposed when we'll be out the other side. That's 11 years from now. That's when you think about 11 years and what we're currently seeing, I think there's a good argument that the millennials, the boomers will pass in the next 5 to 10 years. Then it'll be Gen X and millennials.
That's
yes,
gonna take longer than that.
some boomers will take longer, but for the 70 to 78-year-old boomers, give them 10 years, right? Like average life expectancy. Like, I get it, but
their
it's
position
not.
of influence or even effect.
And so
in the
we're going to
society.
see Gen X.
Have you met our president?
Hey, you said it. And then we're gonna see
I did.
Gen
I'm
X.
not saying anything negative. I'm just saying he is an
So Gen X
octogenarian in
and
power.
millennials are going to lead
Factual
us out
statement.
the other side. All I'm
True.
simply saying is I see the tides turning, and it makes me excited
Oh, they're turning,
about
all
my
right.
position as a
the
millennial.
big question mark I have about what you're saying is you're talking about, leaders and we come
I
out
agree.
the other side, and it's like leaders who are rising to what challenge and the other side of what crisis. There's this giant
All right,
blank space.
let me answer. Leaders
Go ahead.
who are rising to the challenge, and it's a simple challenge, and they are overtly and actively doing it right now. And here's the challenge. Hey guys, does everybody realize the emperor doesn't have clothes on?
Right.
That's the challenge. And there are
being
a
gaslit.
ton of leaders. And when I say emperor, I don't mean president. I mean cultural ideology. That's what I legitimately mean. Like, there are a lot of people being like, whoa, there's a bunch of naked people running around.
But I think what
literally
you're
and
describing is the prelude to war, not the so leading up, for example, to the Civil War, right? You had escalating rhetoric on both the slaveholding and free states, right? And you could have sat there in 1860, right, and said, oh, leaders are rising up and all of this stuff, but there is, what I'm saying is there is another shoe to drop there. Like, the fact that the ideological boundaries are being set doesn't mean it's just going to be resolved within the ideological arena. There does actually have to be a thing and a
I don't think he's
crisis
saying
that precipitates which side wins.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that I think we live in
Yes.
a world where we could what if we tried to define what Civil War was then to what that means now? Because I think there's a good argument that politics and the vocal voices is more of the Civil War now. We don't need to go kill the other side.
I hope you're right.
I
just
No,
don't agree.
no, I disagree. I hope.
Well,
Here's hold on. I gotta say something here, Josh. Hold on. All right, Nick. That is my prayer.
That's why
However,
I'm the
as a
optimist.
student of history, as you are, and as a student of the same degree that I have, should tell you that that's not the track record.
There's like maybe twice
and what
in
this
history
book has.
that
No, there's never if going back to the War of the Roses in England, which is how took it back further than that. Every single 80 years, with the exception of one, the only anomaly that broke from this pattern was the Civil War itself, and it was only because of timeline that messed up. But the problem that comes down to, Nick, is that this generation, and this is the point, is about this whole conversation, is that each generation approaches problems differently. And the millennials do not approach problems half
isn't
measured.
that reason it affects us right now? Like us doing this podcast is evidence essentially of society taking a hard line and a stance either side. Like, you know, the adage, right? Well, I'm saying the adage of like everybody has a podcast now, right?
No,
because
what I'm saying
everybody
is
feels like they need to say something.
Yeah, everyone's talking.
Right? Like we're tired of sitting still.
Yeah, but the baby boomers weren't lighting things on fire, like, and blowing things up the same way. You know what I'm saying?
Like, an alternative that doesn't involve violence.
So here's a question. Here's the question.
We hope that's true.
Somebody's
going to get
violence. Let's say let me say best case scenario.
Outside or inside of the country, revolution or conquest.
Let's take a look at a hypothetical.
Right now, the conversation over states. Sorry, Josh Anderson, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. I think hypothetical, right? Let's hypothetical. Let's say that Trump gets elected. Let's say that he dismantles at least the deep state or the people that have been in, you know, have been doing shady political things that have not been voted into office. He gets rid of, you know, FBI, CIA in the sense that it doesn't destroy it, but he just rebuilds it or something, restructures it. Do you think at that point that there would be no violence? Or let's just take a step back. If Trump is elected, do you think that there would be no violence, like hardcore violence?
Can I take this one?
At that point,
in the abstract,
I'm just. This is a hypothetical, right? I'm not saying that this is what we're looking forward to, hoping to.
I'd like to answer it in the abstract. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
I think the point you're making is that because these lines have been drawn,
right,
and there are aggressive people with conviction on opposing sides, there is not, I think, an electoral. Let me put it more broadly. The existing institutions do not have the machinery for resolving that social conflict.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Right. So then if there's a breakdown, right? The fear is that the federal government takes a side, because ultimately you get the army and or the government inside. Like,
that's not on the table.
No. So this is how you have to look at this. This is how you have to look at this. You can't say, sorry, Josh, you can't, it's not going to, whatever is going to happen, we have no idea what, the only model that we have for civil war in America is the last one. And there's some good parallels to draw on how that would go down if it happened the same way now. But here's the other issue. It could happen. We are not above it. It is 100% possible. But there's also the point that, and to give these guys the credit, it's either that or there's a larger external threat. And the point is this. This is why this matters. We need to have an excuse for one view of the future to take full control.
Yes.
So it will either be in the absence of an external threat that one side can use to justify their consolidation of power and direction of the country. In the absence of that, then it will be internal conflict. That is the historical precedent that has always been, and it would be foolish to suggest, and I'm not saying that you're being foolish, Nick, by suggesting
you're being optimistic.
but I'm saying
you put a great frame right there. I actually think that can, even for a second, help the direction, because there's your fork. Your fork in the road is an external threat, right? We already have Russia going on right now. We already have talk of China and Taiwan. We have talk of Israel, right? Like, those are the ones we know about. And so, like, the next decade, 10 years, that's pretty simple math based on that, 11 years till they say the thing will be over. And so that's the external. In a weird sort of way, that would be the gift. That would be the better path,
for sure,
maybe. And then the other fork in the road is, okay, we have to figure this out internally. And my proposition is simply, I think that I can see a path where we figure it out internally without bloodshed, but that does not mean people are not upset. And I'm simply seeing that path.
Yeah. So
and
Nick,
that's really more of my line.
I agree with that. It is possible. Here's what that would look like. Here's what I'm saying. This is what that could look like. Our system is designed to have a bloodless revolution every 4 years. That's 2.5, every 2 to 4 years. That's what our system's designed for. The problem is nobody up until this point there's not enough people from our generation in power in our government effectively to suggest that the very drastic strides that would be needed for one side or the other to take control through the political process is highly unlikely to happen in that time period. It is possible, theoretically. I just don't see that could play out. And that's kind of, to kind of wrap this up, is kind of like the so what here, right? What's the so what for us?
Your moment is coming.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. Like you wanted it's this. It's like know kind of where we're at in the cycle of history and where, like, what is happening around you. If you're frustrated with your boss, if you're listening to this and you're like, I've got a baby boomer boss and I don't understand why they don't see it. Well, here's the point. They're not going to. They will not see the world the same way that you do, which means you have to think, and I'll use 5 love languages in this concept, but we won't talk about the actual love languages. You have to learn to communicate to that individual in the language and in the nature of the fears, anxieties, and the means in which they see the world, because you have to recognize that generations are a different culture. Josh, you said that earlier, that it's or maybe it was Tim, we were talking about, maybe it's cultural. It is cultural. That's kind of the point we're talking about, is that we give these generations names because we have a culture within ourselves. And it's foolish to attempt to communicate cross-culturally in your native language and expect that it's going to be received the appropriate way, or that you're going to get the outcome that you want. So, if you're a associate pastor or you're aspiring to get into ministry and you're frustrated because you can't get, preaching time at Sunday with your 95-year-old senior pastor, or, you can't get a job in ministry, and if you happen to be one of the older guys listening to this, it helps for you to recognize that, like, there's a generation below you, and knowing what's coming and asking yourself the question, are they prepared for this? Because even though it's not you that's going to be doing it, guess what? You've got more time on the mountain than they do. So what are you doing to equip this generation that's going to have to carry it across?
You're going to need someone younger and stronger to take up that mantle, and because it's not going to be you. It's not going to be you for that much longer.
Yeah, find a replacement now.
Right.
Eyeball them now. I mean, Tim, you said that earlier before we were online. I think that's worth noting again. It's like the thing that your dad did, I'm not going to steal your thunder. That's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah, just intentionally taking, like, younger pastors and it's, bringing them up specifically so that they can take on those roles proactively, so that you're not sitting there, like, the goal is not to be, 80 years old in the pulpit. The goal is to equip someone new who can serve that, whatever the ministerial role is, with integrity and verve and passion that, as you get older, you have less capacity to do. And then, of course, also the recognition that the generation that you're whatever institution it is that you're in, the generation that they need to reach is the upcoming ones. The older generation is, I'm not saying old people can't get saved. I'm saying that old people are largely where they are going to be, and there have been institutions working on them for their whole lives. You do need people who can go relate and appeal to the younger ones. Absolutely.
And I can even speak to that in the, at least in my direct experience in the faith-based nonprofit sector. I have now been in this for 8 years, and it's actually startling and fascinating, because when I go to these massive conferences and I'm in the inner rooms now, I don't know how I ended up finding myself there, but I am. There are, I'm not kidding, at max 10% millennials present, and a massive proportion of the audience is boomers with a smattering of Gen X. And I, tongue in cheek, I call this the moment for the church and for the faith-based nonprofits, because I call them dinosaurs. They are not innovating. They are not finding their replacements. They are holding on. And I've seen now at least 20 organizations just shutter and close their doors because they didn't do this well. I served on a board of an org that had massive influence for 80 years and didn't do the right job of ushering in the next generation to lead as they stepped out. And it failed miserably, or is failing miserably. And it's like, I do think this is a really relevant conversation, because if you're listening, wherever you do fall on the boomer, Gen X, millennial, possibly Z and alpha scales in your respective careers, positions, and aspirations, right? Like, we need to preserve the passing of the baton. And I think that that's been missed culturally by and large, even in the family.
And
even
I
in
want
the
to say,
family.
100%. I'll end with this as last thing. We're harping a lot on what other people need to do.
Hey, I'm a millennial
For the majority
here,
of the
leading the way.
statistics that we see, right? We're all millennials, and I'm going to put it this way:
all
if you're a
millennial?
millennial or Gen Z and you're listening to this,
Sorry. Go ahead.
here is what did not say that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Here's the important thing for us, right? We can only do what we can only do, right? God establishes our plans. We can talk about this. We're talking about this so that you can be aware that you're not alone. Other people go through these frustrations. Here's the nature of the world we live in. And so that older people can listen to this and be aware that these conversations are having. But your responsibility is to be faithful to where God has placed you in the season that you're in, knowing that the time will come when you will be expected to rise up to the occasion. And so whether or not you're getting what you should get idealistically, or whether or not you're getting everything you need, it's not going to change what's going to be expected of you. So
You need to be there holding the light when people start looking for it.
That's right.
I think that is
right.
a really prescient message. Like, ultimately, and I think what you'll see is God is raising you up for a time, right? And when he calls your number, when that light goes on and you're like, it's time to jump, like, you'll know. I feel like you're going to know, like, this is the time. I've had moments kind of like that in the past, when in just witnessing and evangelizing and using apologetics, where I'm doing a lot of research on a particular area that I just feel like God has put an interest on my heart, but I have no place to even express that. But yet in a moment, like, it's time, right? Like, it happens, or the question comes up and it's like, go, right? And so in these microcosmic, moments where you feel like, okay, God's raising you up for such a time as that, that's going to happen for our generation. And so I think, kind of going off of what you're saying, Josh, like, you got to be ready with that light. You got to be prepared. You got to be ready to make that stand when the time comes. And when somebody comes up to you and has those questions, or when it's time to push back, you got to be ready for it. Don't be complacent. Don't sit back, and just be ready for the moment that is coming. Right?
That's right. So like and subscribe.
Leave a comment below what your generation
and then don't
is.
quit.
I would love to hear from you, the different generations out there. I mean, we absolutely see all of you, care about you guys, and want your voice to be heard on this podcast. This has been another excellent conversation on the I'm Telling God About This podcast. Tim, you want to say your last thing and close us out, my friend?
No, I just wanted to apologize to the boomers. There's plenty of you that we love and have a great deal of affection for, and so if we rag on you a little bit, if you're listening to this, you're the exception. Okay?
That's probably true.
Right.
All right, guys, like and subscribe. Thank you for your support, and keep watching. We'll talk to you later.
Bye.